Hey folks, welcome to this presentation, Data, What We Lose When We Treat Students as Objects. I'm Lance Eaton, and this presentation is more an exploration of where our choices are leading us and leading our students. The pandemic has expedited the rate at which we are taking on a lot of different technology, often with scant attention to the downstream effects. So I want to pose some questions and considerations for us to look at as we begin interacting less with students and more with student data files, and the problems that arise when we confuse these things as the same things. I also want to highlight what's below the surface of these choices that students, faculty, support folks, and administration doesn't always see. What is the harm that can be done when we use technology to mitigate relationships in teaching and learning? They can be enhanced, absolutely. Yet, are we also missing something because we're only looking at the surface level? I think so. We can look at these headlines and give a chuckle. Right? A story where students creating connections with chatbots to the point that programmers need to create scripts for those attachments. The flip side of that story is where a president wants a bot of himself to be able to connect with all of his students. We can think of a dozen funny things to say about these things, but I want to think about here is what we're training students for. We often talk about developing soft skills, but we're automating that in deciding some students get chatbots and fictional presidents, while others get the real thing. Can we take a guess as to the socio-cultural makeup of students who get to interact with real people are? Exactly. My question is, though, who gets to see this data? Where is the data stored? What kind of action will result from this data? And do students really know what all of this means? I say really know because, of course, I'm sure each instance of this will come with a 50-page end-user agreement that allows no choice in the user, but all the power in the company with the program. So maybe that feels a little bit too abstract or distant right now. So let's start to ground it in some recent examples and concerns. We have to recognize that while we are using many different data tools in higher education, we're not really sure what most of them are, who runs them, and what their goals are. I go back to one of my earlier experiences where the CIO of a college I worked at, that is the Chief Information Officer, was not an actual employee of the college but worked for the network system that we used for facilitating all information exchange internally. Where was that person's priorities? What did that person want out of our systems? What did that person get to see out of us and use that for encouraging or helping the company over necessarily the institutional's interest? In a similar vein, as we make use of our learning management systems that are owned by private equity groups or make use of third-party vendors for a variety of tools that we then require students to use, how are we making students beholden to entities which have no responsibility to them and can use their data in ways beyond their control? And as we incorporate third-party vendors to jazz up our courses, we also begin to cross borders with our students that can result in negative or harmful consequences. And then we get into some of the tools that we are using that are intentionally used to track, spy, and control students, with levels of surveillance that would sound stalkerish if we were talking about any other human-based relationship. And of course, they are doing poorly at treating our students as humans and protecting them from unwanted risk. That is, of course, when the companies are creating software that creates more problems for students because the underlying artificial intelligence and programming is biased towards certain types of bodies, causing innocent students to have to defend themselves against accusations about cheating from a machine. Do you know how to argue with a machine? Can our students know how to argue with a machine? Because how do you argue against a machine as a student? Can you rationalize with it? Can you rationalize with it? Can you question its programming? Can you even get access to its code because it is intellectual property and subject to patent and copyright protections? So what happens when traditionally alienated students must now convince machines that they are not suspect aberrations or flawed beings, but rather the machine itself is the problem. The machine that the institution has spent lots of money on so it can automate this process of catching students. Of course, then there's the fact that some companies, like Proctorio, are legally going after students and companies who are critical of their work. That's not reassuring in the least. Of course, if you're reading the education news, the discourse is lively and ongoing. Overall, EdTech tools are here to stay, but what about the creepy EdTech? Is that going away? The answer is not really. The tech will continue to stay around, and should we have to pivot again into remote learning, we'll likely go right back to this game of using student data as stand-in for students and making assumptions based on that. That's concerning because it reinforces an antagonistic relationship with students. That in itself is a problem, but particularly as there is a larger discourse critiquing and dismissing higher education, we're only helping that cause as we direct students to chatbots, give them over to third-party vendors who sell their data, and then use surveillance tech to control them, because we don't trust them nor give them effective means to assess them. This can result in real harm for students. This whole conversation has been in my head, developing for years, but it was the Dartmouth Medical School incident that escalated it for me. Basic rundown of what happened is in January of 2021, I'm not sure why that is messed up like that, but we'll keep running with it. Faculty members reported perceived violations of academic integrity to the Committee on Student Performance and Conduct. The committee investigated it and eventually by March sent out 17 letters to meet with the committee. About a month later, 10 out of those 17 were notified of violations and possible sanctions against them for said violations. Now, what tools did they use to determine this? Were they using ExamSoft, Turnitin.com, Proctorio, Respondus, Onolock? These are just a handful of the various surveillance EdTech tools out there to track students when they are as part of their learning process and to catch them cheating or assume that their data is evidence of them cheating. This is what they had set up. They had all students using one computer to which they would be subject to using ExamSoft, which would monitor what they were doing. Then they were also, it's unclear if it was required or strongly encouraged to have a second computer, a backup computer if the first computer fails. I just want to put in there kind of that idea of you need a backup to your security. You need a second backup for this system. And that system too would also need to have ExamSoft, which is of course tracking and surveilling their activities on the computer. So they needed that, but that isn't what Dartmouth used to actually accuse these students of academic dishonesty. All they were largely using was Canvas as a forensic tool. And Canvas is not a forensic tool, but that is what they were using. And then once they accused the students, they provided students with limited information about their case. They would not give them the full data logs or anything like that. They gave them a limited set of information within this accusation. From there, the story kind of evolved. It got picked up by the New York Times, and then you had Freedom Foundation and FIRE, a couple of organizations, as well as student protests start to really push back. And as June rolls around, Dartmouth rescinds those accusations. Somehow in taking it back, no harm has been done. But of course, this has been going on for students for over 3 months. Their academic standing is challenged, is raised into question, and they are sitting in the state of, like, am I getting expelled from medical school? So there is some real harm being done here of those students really having to do that, and also raises the question, if this was not Dartmouth Medical School, if the New York Times or the EFF or FIRE or didn't pick these things up, would those accusations stand, even though the tool that they were using couldn't actually do the thing that they said it was able to do? So the following are a set of questions we should be asking about the tools and ultimately our own approaches and frameworks for teaching and learning. These are conversations faculty should be thinking about in their own practices, with their colleagues, with the instructional design folks at their institutions, and even the administration, and at the students as well. So at the core of this, I think we're ultimately asking the wrong questions of our educational technology. I think we're drawing the wrong conclusions, and I think we're leaving students stuck with those consequences. So what are the internal assumptions and risks involved when we use digital educational technology? We're often aware of the immediate trade-offs of ed tech. If I spend some time learning this tool, then it may offer me quicker or more engaging results. But we sometimes miss the associative fallacies that come with each tool. Take the learning management system as an example. We often frame that as our virtual classroom. By doing so, it leads us to believe that we should have full control of the space and the students should be subject in that space. That comes both with the way that the tool is structured and the way we think about or make the leap from a physical classroom to a virtual classroom. And that's where risk arrives, because that working metaphor then gives us way more power over the student than we would ever have in the classroom. We can control what they see and when they see it. We can see details into their lives and their actions that we would never have access to in day-to-day lives, such as how much time they spend on any given activity or resource. We can see whether they have or haven't accessed a lot of granular data. And like Dartmouth Medical School, we can use that to build a case against them without them ever knowing or being able to see what we see. What information is being collected about our students and how is it being reconfigured to tell us a story about them? What gets tracked is what is trackable, but doesn't necessarily tell us a clear story. We often fill in the gaps, or our assumptions fill in the gaps. This is what happens when we look at students with an eye towards cheating. Often we look at what is collected and then backfill the narrative, rather than asking if we have the full story or if our paradigm of cheating is actually the problem. Since every click in an LMS is captured, and this is the same for any third-party vendor, this means that both students and faculty, it raises a lot of questions about who decides what gets collected and who gets access to this. So who and what systems are collecting this data and what stories are they telling with it? In the LMS, faculty can largely access every click of the students. And whether they realize it or not, some administrators can access every click of the faculty. So who gets access to that, and what stories do they interpret from that digital breadcrumb trail? Because time and again, I think our assumptions from what we see are going to misguide us, since we're only looking at the data file and not at the person. There is a disconnect between those two that we're not always making. We assume they are one and the same, and I think that's one of the places we are going astray. So in a piece I wrote a few months ago, I made an argument that a lot of people felt uncomfortable with. I said, students should have the same level of data access to their instructors as instructors do of their students. Would this change a faculty member's behavior in the LMS if a student could see how much time they spent on grading, reading discussion posts, etc.? And if so, would we find faculty gaming the system with different apps or tools to make it look like they were doing the work? If the answer is yes to either of these, then we need to reconsider what does it mean about who gets access to the data in these spaces and who doesn't. When it comes to third-party vendors, do you or your students have a say in any of this? Right? So who has access to that data and who does not? And then what does that mean for what we can see and who gets to see? So what is done with that data? Does anyone know how long the data lives on after it is collected, how it is used, how responsible are the data collectors to share directly if there has been a theft of that data? The lingering question I think about here is centered in Chris Gilliard's concept of digital redlining, Shoshana Zuboff's concept of surveillance capitalism. In both of these cases, we see that the wheeling and dealing of information gleaned from a variety of sources can lead to limiting opportunities or hypersurveillance in the case of digital redlining for individuals from communities that have been marginalized, or how much more information is collected on a person even when they would prefer that not be the case. Again, it's worth reminding ourselves that some of the major LMSs are owned by private equity entities who also own lots of other data collecting businesses. Similarly, with third-party vendors, they are often as much in it for the data and selling of that data as they are for the tools that they're actually offering. Right? This is that concept: if you aren't paying for it, you are the product. And so this is the crux of the concern I'm thinking about. These are crude tools that don't help us to humanize and understand our students, but to process them. Our students are struggling with a world that feels less and less stable, whether it's the environment, the job market for jobs that pay a living wage at least, healthcare and mental health, a pandemic, housing affordability, and many other challenges that we likely do not know. The data these tools show us will not help us understand this and understand them, but it has a lot of potential for us to do more harm. So I come back to this question because I think we need to do more than just be mindful about data structures we are navigating. We have to make sure that if we are asking or demanding students use these tools, that they fully understand what is at stake. Because it doesn't look like it is stopping anytime soon, and in fact may be getting worse. So what responsibilities do we as educators invested in equity have in making clear what is and can happen to their information on these platforms? We have some of these proctoring sites in the name of security, catching students creating other websites that are intentionally structured to offer false answers and catch them. That is, we're entering into this weird space of entrapment efforts by the services that we're likely paying for to go and validate their work by enticing students to break the rules set up within a course. This is not normal, and yet this is what we're seeing happening. And maybe you're not using proctoring tools and just relying on the learning management system. That doesn't necessarily mean much in protecting your students from data abuse. After all, if Canvas's rating here as a 63% was a grade, it wouldn't be able to transfer with credits in privacy to any other institution. And it's not just the LMS. As we move into ebooks, traditional publishers see this as a boon, not just to contractually control what students can see. That is, you no longer buy ownership, but you buy 6 months access, and after that you can't actually go back to it. But also, they are using student labor to improve the product and therefore be able to, down the road, charge more for students and schools in the long run. So they are also now extracting resources, extracting labor from students so that they can find ways to further sell the same things that they're doing now and also newer products. And all of this points to a bigger problem. How much and who is taking in that data and for what purpose? I don't say this as a scare tactic of big tech is watching. Rather, it comes from a place of seeing a strong disconnect around tools, data, and the actual lived experiences of students. Sometimes these may align, but when they go astray, they are likely to go wildly astray, and often in ways that alienate people on the margins within the institute. This seems to be the exact opposite of what we're striving to do. So I leave you with this as some food for thought to consider as you use the different tools throughout your educational institute, and think about what does that mean for your students. Thank you very much. So, hello folks. Sorry. um, Thank you, Susan. I think I don't. It's funny, and me and Ruth are like we were both in instructional design programs together, and I am not as much of a like digital pessimist as as that presentation might seem, but I think for me there's a lot of question. Like I technology is a central piece of my life, and for the critiques that I'm offering, like it still doesn't stop me from, having my personal email be Google and or be Gmail and things like that. Um, but I also feel like I come at it with the awareness and an exception of the trade-offs and the recognition of my own my own position in society that makes me feel I have some choice and some power and agency in the matter. And so for me, it's really thinking about, on behalf of the students, how we're doing this, how we're structuring this, how we're even engaging with them in conversations. And so um, I would love to kind of open this up to questions, conversations. I include a resource there which actually has some areas for notes for prompts that are kind of extensions of what we covered or what was addressed in that session. But I'd just be curious to hear from folks. Um, are there things that you're thinking about uh, upon viewing that beyond beyond that was horrifying? But I think that there is that interesting question of bad actors or just or even in the actors that don't necessarily realize they're bad, or near realize they're having potentially negative or downstream effects. I'll throw out there as well. I'd be curious if folks who may be a little more familiar with this or um, may have some kind of conversation with students around this, or is there people here who have been thinking about these things and feel like they either have a good way of discussing these things or uh, have tried to have these conversations. So two pieces coming up: the tough conversations to have when the university relies on these programs to deliver to deliver the content. Yes, I think that's kind of where I'm thinking about, and I think I've been thinking about it a lot, both because of that particular case that I drew out around the Dartmouth Medical School, and also because at my institution we're in this transition to a new LMS, and so it has me thinking about these questions and wondering, where and how does it sit and who has access to it, particularly because the institution that I'm at is one that is particularly geared towards students who have been traditionally marginalized or excluded um, from traditional higher education. So absolutely, I saw the question before that is, what is the role of data? And I think that's an interesting question to be asking throughout all levels of the institution. And it's not that data is bad, right? It's where are the different levels about what are we doing with it? Why are we gathering it? When does it end? Because I think that's the other, particularly as it goes into when we're dealing with third party vendors, uh, and just thinking about the fact that the two of the bigger LMSs, uh, Blackboard and Canvas, are owned by private equity groups who also own lots of other data collecting entities. So I think there's some really interesting questions there. Jumping into the chat from Sarah, it feels like technologies like these are mostly, not always, freely chosen because of, oops, the chat went up a little bit. Um, because of faculty time constraints due to other responsibilities they have. How can we help faculty find the time to do the things like authentic assessment? I think that is a really, that is that is one of the biggest challenges in all of this, kind of our overall cultural and social structures that are on this hyper production model, this hyper production, we must churn, and I've run into a lot of thinking about that in the classes that I teach, in the faculty that I work with, in the institutions that I'm at, of what does that, how much are we just all stuck on very different types of hamster wheels? um So Shahida says here in ODS, we administer exams to some students who do not want to be observed or recorded. They are very wary of being flagged for movements. Yes, due to their disabilities, and that is, one piece of it. And of course, for those students who have those documented disabilities, and then we also know there's a large portion, or there's a significant portion of students in higher education who are either undiagnosed, whether it is by choice, by systemic failure for them to have access to the things that they need for a variety of different reasons. And so it's I think it's phenomenal that that can happen, and that there's a better awareness of that. And also, where does that, that we also know there's that that doesn't work for everybody, and that's part of the challenge. Joe's comment is, data can be exceptionally effective at predicting student success and helping to get students any assistance needed in classes. Um, and Susan seconds that with, we found that for sure in medical school admissions, like 100%. And I think this is one of the challenges, is how how do we balance that line? How do we balance, like, ways in which it can be used to uplift, it can be used to spot and find supports for, and not in the more punitive ways. And I think we see this in society as a whole as we deal with data. Like, we see this in the ways in which policing happens, and the challenges around how data, constructs certain things that then create new realities, or realities that they create views that aren't actually reflecting reality. In yes, students are there's interesting different studies around students. To Joe's point about they've lived their entire lives online. I think it's first just recognizing there's still a digital divide, and that still exists across, socioeconomic, and cultural structures. So yes, some students have lived their entire lives online. That said, like, some of the research that I have seen is they instill trust in higher education around, like, what they are doing. So the fact that an institution, say, is invested in Canvas, which has that 63% privacy effectiveness score, raises questions and concerns about, do we actually earn that trust? And you know it's great, it's fine that they want to, that some students may want to do that, but there's still plenty of students who may not want to, or upon understanding the downstream implications, may have may either be affected unknowingly or even knowingly. And so that raises other interesting questions for us. um Man, this is a great conversation. um so yeah, more discussions of, are they aware that it's going on? Absolutely. um that idea of, students are aware of this. Again, different students will be. And awareness, it's an interesting question of awareness and realization of ability to do it. So in their personal lives, we know, because they came into a world that the adults around them constructed for social media and creating all of these digital networks, was just a given. Like, it is hard for them to untangle themselves, or to feel like they can untangle themselves. Uh, in fact, even in our institutions, I would have no doubt if, any career center at a college would say, "Oh, uh, no, you don't need a you don't need a LinkedIn account. You don't need you don't need to create a digital footprint if you are out there applying for jobs to show that, like, you exist in all of these things." So yes, they may know, and they may have this kind of um, I think there's ways in which they may feel kind of given up to, or not feeling like there's a means of challenging. And I think that's an interesting place for higher ed, in different capacities, in different disciplines, to raise that question, to engage in that discussion of what it means, that we have these different pieces, that we have these different demands upon us, including how we show up digitally. It's just like I said, I don't think we do, and I think when you look at the amount of data an institution gathers for a student, um, everything from their beginning, so from the moment they become a marketing lead to literally when they die, because they're always now data for the institution. They'll go through the school, and then even if they don't graduate, they still become part of the alumni, because at many institutions, alumni now include anybody who's gone to the school, in part so that that's one more marketing tool to reach it, to reach out. So like they are pulled into this, this large structure of themselves as data to which the school continually uses, again up until they die, in order to um, in order to both continue that connection, which some of that is authentic, and also to get resources from. And again, most of these different spaces are using a variety of different tools internally and externally. All right, so the conversation is continuing to go on. This is great. Distinctions about kind of knowledge and knowing, and being cognizant of what it means, or how that happens in terms of data. Uh, so Karen mentions pose that predicting success happens within a narrow framework, a framework that may be very well missing alternative markers of success. That is, from my vantage point at my institution, that is something we talk about a lot, and something we think about a lot and try to document a lot as well. And yeah, it happens differently in different departments and different programs. So the medical, we also have certain spaces within institutions where test taking is expected, required, and part of a process of certification. And so that makes all of this that much more complicated as well. I feel you, Susan. That's what I got ready for after this presentation. There's a data point where there's a data point I think we can all agree on, or many of us can agree on. I mean, I'd be curious for folks, to what degree. I mean, have I'd be curious, and again, feel free to put it into the chat. Like, how many people have dug into the data tools in their own LMS and looked up students? Um, I mean, I can tell you part of the other reason I've gone down this path is I've been teaching now for actually we're coming upon 16 years, and I think about some of my earlier practices very much in that tradition of like what happened at Dartmouth Medical School, uh, of really using the LMS as an adversarial tool. And I think a lot about that. Um, you know I, so yeah, I think it's great of the check student access of the LMS in a couple different instances. There for me, some of this has come from really reflecting on my practices and realizing the harm that having access to data and never having a really good conversation about what it means to have access to that. So I have done things. One of my examples is using the LMS to figure out if students have access to reading, and then in class using it as a mechanism to call students out. And that's not something I am by any means proud of, and it's something I think a lot about, kind of what I was trying to do in those moments. And so I think there's interesting questions about all of how what we have the power to use, and how that is introduced to us, how we end up using it, and where is the real return for helping and educating students. Oh, there's a rich conversation about uh, medical professions and assessments, absolutely. um, and looking at LMS data logs. I'm guessing other people have gone and gotten that drink.
A lot of LMSs work in tandem with other third-party tools. And a lot of, I know that when I was at Quinsigamond, we had Starfish
Hmm.
that kind of flagged students when they were missing assignments and all of that kind of thing. So it seems like a real tangle of relationships between some data in one system and data in another. So you kind of lose track of who's got the most data
Hmm.
out of all this. What is your reaction to using these? Not these third-party tools are supposed to be to help disadvantaged students
Hmm.
through advising and that sort of thing. So I just want to, get your take on those type of situations.
It, it's a thank you, and it's a complicated mess because on its face value, 100%, like having a tool that can flag support systems for students is like we need that. Um, but part of the reason, so yes, we need that, and also part of the reason we need that is because we haven't like we've traded in those technologies for supporting faculty to be able to have a tenable load of courses and students to which they themselves could actually like keep an eye on that and develop reasonable rich relationships with students. So like that's one piece of it. The other is that for me, one of the biggest challenges is those companies like accumulate that data from Quinsigamond and the 2,000 other schools that I don't know how many schools Starfish has, but let's pretend that it's 2,000. And then what they're doing is they're iteratively mining it for new patterns, new algorithms to create, to track, to do all of these things. And they're doing it across like institutions that are very different. They're doing it across students that are very different, culturally, socially, socioeconomic, um, geographically. And then they're creating like these newer algorithms that are based upon what becomes a very generalized population and giving them back to institutions, which means you might start flagging or you can be flagging students who aren't necessarily in problematic situations or be over flagging students who for one reason or another don't actually need it, or underflagging other students because the data is being read in different ways. So I think for me is it creates this dynamic of like making it seem like there is this box of what concerns look like, and the only way I see that box happening is if we're teaching the same course to the same student across, you know, a bunch of different a bunch of different semesters. So I get concerned about that piece. Then I get concerned about the larger company and what else is that data used for. As we saw, there's some companies who are like use that to leverage new products to other industries. Then there's the whole question and concern around data breaches and what happens when that information ends up elsewhere. And the example that comes to mind is not necessarily like the direct thing that is I'm concerned is going to happen, but something similar to the fact that we have these really uh, we have these places online that have kind of taken lots of that information and been able to feed it into different machine learning algorithms to create things that then become fodder for other entities. So whether that is using using people's what's the term? is it scraping Facebook for all of for all these publicly available images to then create an AI that creates images or uses those pictures in different ways that are beyond the user's control. Like, what happens when something like that happens with student data that's been mined in different ways? Or what happens when at some point somebody decides that, as credit score becomes the indicator of a good person or not, as we see similarly happening, or has happened in China, of like using lots of different metrics to discuss to determine one's social score. What happens when there's different entities, including how students perform in classes, based upon different assumptions, that gets fed into a social score that will probably run along the lines of how we do credit scores, which are made up of millions. Sorry, Susan. um, but like we have this credit score that, like, there's all these different data points that go in to feed that, to arbitrarily change it, or change it in ways that you don't expect. Like, why is it that if I pay off and I cancel a credit card, my credit score goes down? And so that level of, like, what feels very irrational spaces, I think, as we see different companies play around with, or the creation of something like social scores, um, or whatever happens in the forthcoming metaverse, and how we accrue identity and popularity there, and what that means for our real lives, like, all of this data is sitting there for us, for companies to play around with. And so that also makes me concerned when, again, like, as I said, Blackboard and Canvas are good examples of, like, if you look at all the other companies that those private equity groups own, they're all around data collection in several different industries: education, medical and health spaces. So those are things that, I've just been thinking about. I think Susan's going to have 2 drinks now.
I think we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that I thank you, Lance, for agreeing to present at our conference. I know you're at the end of the day, which I guess is good, because everyone can go have a have a little break after this, with a nice cold drink. And I think that you really opened our eyes to we're never going to look at student data the same, and I'm very grateful that you agreed to to present today. Thank you.
My pleasure, Ruth.
It's great
And
seeing you.
you as well. And Susan, to your question, this is part of why I think at any level we can begin to have these conversations with students, fellow faculty, administrations, and also challenge the tools that we bring into the class, very intentionally, of being able to really ask of them what is going on, and the like. I don't know that I can't say, like, oh, that will fix everything, but I do think that's a place for us to be starting, is with our classrooms and our students, and really trying to draw out these concerns. Thank you, everybody. This is great.